One could be forgiven for thinking that these are very dark days. There's the Russian-Ukraine crisis. China, of course, continues to spread its power and influence across our own region. Tensions in the Middle East are likely to intensify. But there is, as always, another side to the story. And the story is this, that by any objective criteria, when it comes to poverty, education, health levels, and so on and so forth, the world, believe it or not, is getting better. And as capitalism's achievements pile higher, the more unpopular capitalism seems to have become. Well, Marian Tupy is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute's Centre for Global Liberty and Prosperity. He's editor of humanprogress.org. He's author of two very important books that are relevant to this evening's event. One is 10 Global Trends Every Smart Person Should Know, and most recently, Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet. Marian is also the narrator of PragerU's recent video series, The Best Time to Be Alive, and at last count it's reached more than 500,000 views online. Now finally, a bit of personal history about Marian. He was born in communist Czechoslovakia. He moved with his parents to South Africa. He completed his studies in Great Britain, or as he and Fraser will point out, Scotland. And that was before he moved to the United States. And with that, please welcome Marian Tupy.
Thank you, Tom, very much for the introduction and also for bringing me to Australia. And of course, thanks to all the donors for making trips like these possible. So much appreciated. My first assessment, being here for 30 hours, is that this is a very beautiful country, prosperous, safe, clean. So congratulations on being born here or immigrating. Well done. So I have 15 minutes to talk about human progress. It comes, the slides come from my first book. Some of them are a little bit dated by now, but most of the slides that you will see basically chart the scope of human progress. And just bear in mind that if everything was working out for everyone everywhere at all times, this wouldn't be human progress. That would be a miracle. The argument I'm making is not a Pollyannish one. I'm not arguing that we live in the best of worlds. I'm not arguing that best of possible worlds. I'm not arguing that there are no problems in the world. What I'm saying, and thank God I have doubt on my side, is that humanity tends to make two steps forward, one step back. The line or the graph of human progress, it is not a straight line, it is a jagged one, but over time, especially over the last 200 years, as I will try to show in my presentation, something important has happened in the world. We have truly separated ourselves from the previous 300,000 years of human existence. The last 200 years mark a dramatic departure from what human experience was like. And of course, the first one of which will be the growth in GDP per capita. Roughly speaking, going back to the birth of agriculture 10,000 years BC, GDP per capita was about $2 per person per day. Even in times when people were not remunerated for their work, what we are talking about is basically equivalent in productivity, in human productivity was about $2 per person per day. From the time of Christ to 1800, this has grown globally to about $2.80. So 80 cents adjusted for inflation in a scope of 1800 years. From 1800 to today, it grew to about $35 to $40 adjusted for inflation. So over the last 200 years, we have basically moved from about $2.80 to about $35 to $40 per person per day adjusted for inflation, which means that your average ordinary human being, let's say somebody in the middle of the income bracket, somebody living in Mexico, is 18 times better off than he or she was 200 years ago. Their ancestors were 200 years ago. And what's so important about that is that really the line of wealth remains flat for thousands of years. Your standard of living would be equivalent to that of your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather, and your children, their great-children. It wouldn't change. And in the last 200 years, as you can see in front of you, everything has changed. Now, with the massive increase in wealth comes a massive decrease in human poverty, measured by $2 per person per day. But the same slope or similar slope can be observed at the level of $3 or $4 per person per day, and even $7 per day. So whether you look at $2 per person per day or you go higher, we are seeing a decline in absolute poverty. Roughly speaking, 90% of people lived in absolute poverty all over the world 200 years ago. In 1980, about 40%. Today, it's down to about 8 or 9%. Whereas this particular chart ends in 2018, the World Bank has just produced its newest assessment of global poverty, and indeed, global poverty after the COVID shock has continued to decrease. This is absolute poverty, obviously. Very few people know that global inequality is decreasing. Let me just start by saying that the left tends to focus on income inequality. Now, there are a plethora of other inequalities in the world which are decreasing. The gap between the number of children who die before their first birthday, the gap between the developed world and the developing world is continuing to shrink. Life expectancy gap opens up during the Industrial Revolution. People in the West start living much longer. That gap is also shrinking. So there are all sorts of inequalities which are decreasing, and it's very important that we insist or rather that we don't fall into the trap of focusing on income inequality only. But even income inequality is decreasing as developing countries have grown at a much faster pace than developed countries. Then obviously income inequality has decreased over time. Branko Milanovic, who is the world's expert on global inequality, has just produced an updated chart, and indeed the numbers are even more impressive. And no, that's not just about China. The world truly is becoming much less unequal economically. Education, obviously, up to 100% of children now receive primary schooling. That doesn't mean that they receive high quality primary schooling. That's very important to acknowledge. Nonetheless, that has been an impressive gain. Tertiary education is basically exploding for better and for worse. The 200 years ago, you might expect a global average was half a year spent at school for your average inhabitant of the world. Today, it's about 8 or 9 years. So obviously, we are getting much more educated. We are creating much more human capital, which then is translated in most cases to productivity gains. Global illiteracy. 200 years ago, again, I'm talking about 200 years because it's such an important mark in human history. 90% of the world were illiterate. Today, it's about 10% of the world who are illiterate. Global access to internet and other technologies blossoming, obviously. I think it was about 2015 that the world has reached 50% penetration of internet, and that's also spreading to sub-Saharan Africa, the world's poorest continent. Life expectancy. For most of human history, this was about 25 to 30 years. Even in 1900, in the richest parts of the world, like the United States and the United Kingdom, the average life expectancy was about 50 years. Well, today, globally, it's 73 years. In the United States, it's 78 years. In places like Hong Kong, it's 85 years, and in Japan, it's 88 years. So we are living we have 2 additional lifetimes to enjoy, thanks to modern medicine, greater incomes, greater investment in healthcare, and so forth. Infant mortality. This particular data set has to do with infant mortality, but when it comes to children overall, defined from 0 to 15, in Sweden in the 18th century, 40% of children between the age of never reached their 15th birthday. Similar statistic for Bavaria was 50%. So a woman could expect every second child to die before their 15th birthday. That was not unusual in hunter-gathering societies. To this day, child mortality is about 50%. Well, today, globally, it is 4%, and in most developed countries like the Nordic countries, it's 0.3%. So once again, a tremendous improvement, also mirrored in declining maternal mortality. I don't have that slide, but you can look it up. Food supply, contrary to the doomsters, global population growth, which has risen from 1 billion people in 1800 to 8 billion people today, has not resulted in massive starvation. Quite the contrary. Today, if people in sub-Saharan Africa, which is to say the world's poorest continent, enjoy a diet similar to those of the Portuguese in the 1960s. Increasingly, obesity is a problem in Africa. There was a study out of Kenya that especially in rural areas, people are becoming obese. Interestingly, even though our life expectancy is increasing, and as you know, with increased life expectancy, you are developing a greater risk of cancer. Cancer death rates are decreasing. Now, this has to do primarily with the tremendous increases in our knowledge about cancer and greater medical advances. But it also puts to rest the idea that somehow the environment is so messed up that it is killing us because of, I don't know, toxins in the water or in the air or the food that we eat. Bottom line is cancer death rates are decreasing in spite of a huge increase in life expectancy, and that is something to celebrate. This is just a fun little thing to show you that I'm going to say it again. The last 200 years are so important partly because people never thought of solving medical challenges. People simply assume that if you fell sick or if you got polio or smallpox or Black Plague or whatever, that it was God's wrath or maybe the passage of Saturn, and people simply lived with it, and it never occurred to anybody that you could cure people, but also that you could actually eliminate entire illnesses or sicknesses. And so we have good evidence of polio and smallpox in 1500 BC in India and in Egypt, and it really took until modernity that got solved through vaccines, and then more recently you can see that the amount of time spent coming up with new cures is decreasing. I think it took about 43 years to come up with a vaccine or treatment. I can't remember which. It took about 43 years. HIV took about 15 years. It started in 1980 to be reported. By 1995, you have the first antiretroviral drugs. And of course, after COVID emerged, it took days for Moderna to come up with its vaccine, which then had to be tested. But the point is that with increased technology, supercomputing and so forth, we are able to come up with vaccines much sooner. Wage gap. Wage gap between men and women remains a problem in certain countries. In the West, what we are finding that once you adjust for differing jobs that women take on average, once you adjust for the number of hours worked, basically the wage gap disappears or becomes statistically insignificant. But outside of the West, for example, South Korea, wage gap remains a problem. But ultimately, after you make all the proper adjustments, men and women are paid equally for the same jobs. Women in politics. Increasing in number, both in the total number of women. Well, first of all, it's the universal right to vote. I believe that first country where women obtained the right to vote was New Zealand in 1893. Today, women can vote pretty much anywhere except the Vatican, I think. I don't know. Enjoy. Needless to say, slavery is illegal everywhere, and even sexual minorities. First country to abolish penalties for homosexuality was, I think, France, but then obviously much more egalitarian treatment of sexual minorities today. Even environmental trends are improving. This is especially important for young people. Young people tend to be obsessed about the environmental issues, for better and for worse. We will probably talk about natural resources a little bit later, but the point is that natural resources are falling in price relative to wages, which a price tells you whether something is becoming more scarce or more abundant. And the second book is basically devoted to natural resources. And what we find is that resources are basically becoming cheaper. Human beings are not just consumers; they are also creators. We can create new resources, we can find new resources, we can supplement new products for the resources that we used. We no longer use whales for for candles. We now have electricity. So basically resources are becoming cheaper. Tree coverage is exploding in Europe and in the United States. In the last between 1982 and 2016, we have added 35% of tree coverage, new trees. China has added 15% or increased its tree coverage by about 15%. Every year, a certain number of trees get cut down and a certain number of trees get planted, which is why it's the blue dot, which is important. That's the net change in forest coverage. Obviously, Asia doing very well. Europe, North America, Oceania is plus positive. Africa is tiny bit deforesting, but that's almost zero, and the problem remains in South America, especially in Brazil. If the world's farmer, if the average world's farmer could become as efficient as an American or an Australian farmer, we could return the land mass the size of India back to nature and still be able to feed 8 billion people and even more, meaning that there are huge productivity gains that have been obtained in advanced economies in terms of agricultural production per acre of land, and the amount of land used for agriculture to feed humanity has peaked in I believe 2020, and it has started to decrease. Once again, if we can make farmers in non-Western countries be as productive as we are, then we also have less of a problem with the exploitation of natural habitat. Fauna, flora can rebound, etc. Basically, as people become richer, they become much more interested in protection of their environment. If you go to the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean, half of the island is the island of Haiti, GDP per capita $1,000. The other half of the island of Hispaniola is the Dominican Republic, GDP per capita $11,000. Haiti is completely deforested. Forests cover the Dominican Republic. Why does that happen? It's because, as I said, rich people tend to have the spare income, and it's a nice environment is a luxury good, essentially, we have the resources to basically increase the number of sites that are national parks, and also the coverage. Currently, I believe that 7% of the world's oceans are where fishing is banned, that is roughly the size of South America, and that is supposed to increase to 30%, according to the United Nations, and also 15% of land mass is also preserved for animals. That's the area twice the size of the United States, globally speaking. I don't know why I'm obsessing about fish. I guess because I like them. The point is that 50% of fish consumed around the world today are farmed, are grown to be eaten, and as opposed to caught in the wild. So aquaculture is obviously a huge business in Chile, in Ecuador, in many other countries. And what we want to do is to basically get to a point where all the fish that we consume are farmed and grown for consumption rather than caught in the wild, so that the fish stocks around the world can actually rebound, because we do have a problem with overfishing, primarily caused by vast fleets of Chinese fishing ships who ignore international laws and environmental concerns. And this is basically just a follow-up on what I was saying. This is global cereal yield from the 1960s. This includes rice, wheat, and I forget, and the third one. And as you can see, basically per acre of land, we just can produce so much more. And the key now is to genetically modify crops so that we not only grow more, but that we also use less pesticide, less fertilizer, and less water. And if we can produce crops like that, then we also avoid environmental problems such as runoff of pesticides and fertilizer into oceans, into rivers and into oceans. So that's the next step in the agricultural revolution. Growth of urban population, by 2100, 85% of humanity will live in the cities. This is an environmental indicator. Why? Well, it's an economic and environmental indicator. It's an economic indicator because people in the cities are the ones who are producing economic growth, economic development, and innovation. So the more people live on top of each other, sharing ideas, talking, the more economic growth you have. But also, people in the cities consume much less resources and much less energy. They have much less of an environmental impact, and so the more people are in the cities, once again, we can return land to nature. Average hours of work in high-income countries, there is a sort of an inverted U shape to number of hours that people work. When you are a newly industrializing country like Britain was in the 1800s or South Korea was in the 1970s, people start working many, many more hours because now they are getting compensated a lot of money. So what they want to do is to make as much money as possible. And at some point they decide, okay, we have other priorities, such as we want to travel, we want to spend more time with our families and so forth. And so once you reach that peak industrialization, after that, number of hours worked tends to decline. In Western Europe, certainly in the United States, in the last 70 years, we've seen 11 or 12% decrease in the total number of hours worked. Work-related death rates, workplace is becoming much safer. I discussed the details in the book. I realize, ironically, that I'm speaking whilst two hot wars possibly are going on. But compared to human history, we do live in very peaceful times. 500 years ago, great powers were at war with one another 100% of the time. 100% of the time. If it was springtime, the army would cross into the neighbor's territory and war would commence. That's what people did. And war was the default. This is very important. War was the default of international relations. Today it is peace. So we are shocked when something like the Russian invasion of Ukraine happens. Why? Because we don't expect it. Our ancestors would not be surprised at all. So overall, we are seeing a long period of peace. This year marks 70 years since the last time two great powers were at war, and that was China and the United States and Korea. And miraculously, we are also safer from the acts of God. In the last 100 years, the number of people who have died due to extreme weather, earthquakes, floods, fires, tsunamis has decreased by 99%. And that also tells you about the corrupt nature of the discourse that claims that we are living through an existential crisis. Existential for whom? If it's existential crisis from a human perspective, then we are certainly not living through an existential crisis because 99% because many fewer people are dying due to extreme weather. Why? Well, because richer societies can build better houses, because we can have sensors at the bottom of the sea, which tells us when there is an earthquake and there may be a tsunami coming. Then we have loudspeakers and phone alerts that tell us that we should move to higher ground. We have satellites in the sky that predict where the hurricanes are going. So that's the reason why we are also safe from acts of God. Homicides are down globally, and even when wars do take place, fewer people per 100,000 die as a result of war. So they tend to be over quicker. I realize once again we have here a paradox of the war in Ukraine, but conflicts tend to lead to many fewer deaths. Thank you very much.
Our next guest is Fraser Nelson. Now, he has been the editor of the UK Spectator since 2009. And it's a brilliant publication, the UK Spectator. You may have been familiar with the Australian edition, which I used to edit and is edited by Rowan Dean, who's here this evening. Please welcome Fraser Nelson. Now, Fraser, as you take your seat, given that you've published a lot of editorials on the Golden Age, I think for a long time they used to publish every Christmas an editorial on the Golden Age and that the world's getting better.
Yeah, why this year was the best year in human history. Every year for 10 years, it was true every year.
So I take it you'd agree with the thesis?
Yeah, I do. And as you were saying earlier on, the question, to me, it's one of the greatest stories of our age, right? You'll never see this when you pick up the papers. You almost, now when I ran that article every Christmas saying this is the best year ever, the staff in the office would hate it. They just simply would think this is a lie, right? You're fudging the figures somehow. No, everything has got worse. Now, I don't think that, and why is that? Now, of course, because you don't see this in the news. And then that gave me some soul searching. I'm an editor. I choose what people read in the publication. Why don't I publish more good news? Is there some conspiracy? Now, when I looked into this, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this, the reason you will never hear a story anywhere else is quite simple. Because people don't pick up the newspapers to find out what's going right. It's just not human nature. You pick it up to find out what's going wrong. If I do is the mic not working? Sorry. If I run I've tried this on The Spectator. If I do a story with a positive headline, it gets, broadly speaking, 5% to 10% of the clicks of something with a negative headline. Now, that means, and that is just, again, people want to know, we don't have time. If you're going down the pub and you're gossiping, you don't want to find out that Mr. and Mrs. Smith are having the 25th year of happy marriage. You want to find out whose marriage is falling apart, who's, some kids had a kid. You want to hear the gossip, as it were. As human, we are evolved from the people who worried back in the day. People who took it easy got eaten by the dinosaurs or whatever. We are just prone as survivors of the ancients to scan the horizons for threats. So we're always, part of our little CPU of our brain is looking out for threats. We want to find out what we should be concerned about, not what's going right. So that simply is human nature. Newspapers don't exist if they don't tell people what they want to find out about. And by and large, there is a public interest in finding that news, by and large, is something somewhere doesn't want you to print. Now, of course, this means that judging a country by its newspapers is a bit like judging a city by spending a night in the emergency ward at the hospital. You only ever see what's going wrong. But you're never quite aware of his negativity bias. So if you were to do any one of those figures in Marian's fascinating presentation, a lot of which I've never seen before, and I'm interested in the field, are just incredible stories. Look at the cancer survival rates, for example. They are just things which you wouldn't believe. I had 2 days ago, I was on this cruise with some brilliant figures from Australian politics, and they were asking me, when's the last time you were in Australia? I said 25 years ago, and it's come back, and Sydney's, such a better city than the one I remember. And a few of them said, no, I think it's gone downhill, actually, Now, there is always a sort of pessimism bias you have for your own city, for your own country, where the facts are just unarguable, that if you had to choose any time to be alive, you couldn't choose when, but you could where, but you could choose when, then you would choose right now. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And it's something which is statistically and objectively true, but there has never been a better time to bring children into the world. Never. Never been a better time to be young than right now. But we just are programmed not to believe it.
Okay, I'll try to test you on that later on, but back to your thesis, Marian. How much praise does capitalism and the market economy and technological innovation, how much is that part of your story?
No, it's a huge part of the story. Angus Deaton has written a whole book about it. When capitalism started producing big wealth, what happened with that money was that it got turned into, for example, sewers. In London and many other cities around the world, which then contributed to greater hygiene and massive decrease in mortality. So capitalism is incredibly important because it enables everything else to happen. Paul Collier from Oxford has this phrase, growth is not everything, but it is the main thing. And without growth, we wouldn't have... Another point is that richer societies tend to be much more tolerant societies. When you see women being oppressed around the world, it tends to happen in countries. I don't want to use the word that Donald Trump had for countries like that, but it tends to happen in countries with a very low level of economic development. It is also a place where gays get thrown off buildings. It is with wealth that we are not just becoming richer, but we're also becoming better people. And that's something that I didn't talk about in my presentation, that I genuinely believe that we are a much more humane species than we used to be. In how we treat each other.
Yes, and as I said in my introduction, which I think is borrowed from a line in one of your recent Telegraph columns, Fraser, that as capitalism achievements pile higher, the more unpopular capitalism seems to become. And I'll quote you here, that the big charities which witnessed free trade cutting poverty faster than any scheme of handouts seems to hate capitalism the most.
Well, part of it is a generational thing. Timothy Garton-Ash, a professor at Oxford, has got this quite interesting expression. He would say that a lot of people are defined by a major historical event in their lifetime. I would be an 89er, somebody whose worldview was defined by the collapse of communism. So I would grow up comparing capitalism to communism, freedom to the opposite. And so that to me was the defining thing. When I was younger, we used to go for little drills on what would happen if there was a nuclear attack, etc. When all of that dissipates, it changes the way you see the world. But the younger people don't have any of that. They are more shaped by the events of the crash of 2008 or 2009, and that they witnessed then terrible inequalities. They would see banks getting bailed out. They would see asset prices running away. So because you're younger, you've seen less of life. Obviously, you judge the world by how you see it, and you will have seen some pretty messed up economics in the years after the crash, and that would probably think you that the capitalism, the system is a bad thing. You don't have anything to contrast it against. And you and I, when we were growing up, we did have something to contrast it against. And on top of that, you've got what I call the paradox of progress, that we only ever improve as a species by being unhappy, by thinking things are intolerable, by getting outraged at things that you would never really have cared about a couple of generations ago. So things like child poverty, for example, the way that's defined, every single year it comes down. I think but nonetheless, we still get angry about it. And by the way, quite right so, because we should be getting angry about these things. And human progress is defined as we lower the bar over things which we believe to be an outrage, because those are problems we're urgently going to solve. And I like to think that that my children will get angry about a whole bunch of things that I don't think are particularly controversial now.
But if you speak to young people in this country, Marian, and I suspect it's the same in Britain and America, because the polling evidence is pretty conclusive, they are very depressed about the state of the world, and they blame capitalism for their plight. Now, we have been going through a period of higher inflation as a result of arguably very loose fiscal and monetary policy, but young people will blame the higher inflation and higher interest rates on the market economy, and they'll also blame the capitalism for what we have in Sydney and Melbourne and other parts of the Western world for a housing affordability crisis. How would you respond to those young people who blame capitalism for the housing affordability crisis? Either of you, but Marian.
I don't know much about the Australian situation. What I can tell you is that housing in the United States, on average, I published an op-ed about this in Forbes a couple of years ago, is actually cheaper relative to income, on average. The problem is that a lot of young people find it more interesting and exciting to live in the metropolises of the United States, such as San Francisco, not so much anymore for obvious reasons, but Los Angeles and especially New York, where there is less of a supply and much more of a demand. So there's that issue. But if you look at the average, and if you do the appropriate adjustments, which I did in that article, you recognize that an American home today is much larger than what it was in the 1950s or 1970s. When you recognize all the accoutrements, all the amenities that it has, and especially if you account for a massive drop in interest rate, which certainly was the case until 2020, a secular decline in interest rates over time from something like 13 or 14% in 1980s. Then suddenly you end up in a situation where housing is actually cheaper relative to income. It's reducing as a share of income. Now, could we do better? Absolutely. We do have a problem in the United States with NIMBYism. We do have a problem with zoning, where actual construction is prevented from happening. And this is both a democratic process, whereby people who already bought into a community don't want to allow, they want to pull the ladder behind them. But it is also a matter of, government overregulation and bureaucratization of the process.
So supply side problem,
Yes.
Fraser Nelson.
Well, the other thing we have to remember is that the word capitalism is a controversial word. Now, some people in the free market debate wouldn't use it at all. They say it's a word that was conjured up by the enemies of freedom. It's a daft word that the left used to describe the concept of freedom. Now, there have been also attempts by Johan Norberg and others to try to reclaim it. So he's done the Capitalist Manifesto. That's his latest book, The Joy of Global Capitalism. But by and large, when you hear somebody talking about capitalism, they're not talking about it in a good way. It's used, when we hear it used, it's almost always used to describe a defect of the market economy, whether that's banks being bailed out, whether that's inequality, etc. So it is difficult for our side of the debate to reclaim that word.
Okay, well, let me put this to you. Just in your home country of Britain, taxes are higher than at any time in living memory. Living standards are falling faster. Some 29% of UK children are said to be living in poverty, as are 650 million globally, while, as Oxfam often points out, the top 80 billionaires have more wealth than the poorest half of the world. What's your response to that?
Well, the Oxfam figure is quite interesting. I've got a 10-year-old daughter. She's lovely girl. She's got, how much has she got, honey? £120 or something? she has got more money than the poorest sort of 4 million people in the world. You know, there are lots of people who've got negative net assets. So your average trainee lawyer at Yale University will have negative assets. I mean, this whole thing is a statistical con by Oxfam. I mean, so many people out there have got no assets at all. If you want to find out about global inequality, then look at the figure which you showed there. Global inequality is going down. So Oxfam, typically, they publish this story on the 4th of January every single year. That's because none of the newspapers' A-team are on duty, so everybody repeats it because it's just nonsense anyway. But that is, nonetheless, we do this pre-Davos, and Oxfam wants to, of course, emphasize to the world how terrible and unequal things are because they're fundraisers. That's what they do. They want to say to the people, look, this terrible world is not fair. Why don't you give us some money and we'll make it more fair? Now, of course, when it comes to the proportion of people in relative poverty, that went down during the pandemic. Now, that's not because poverty went down during the pandemic. That's because the average wage come down. So it's basically, this is just it's a slightly deceitful phrase. I would look at absolute levels of poverty. So all of these things, again, is the paradox of progress. You always want to do more, to do better. Although I mean, if you define poverty as the proportion of people below 60% of the average income, which I think is the typical definition, then we're not really talking about poverty. We're just talking about income distribution. And you can use tax credits, as the previous British governments have done, to move people from just under this line to just above it and declare that they've been lifted out of poverty. So like the Oxfam thing, it's a statistical sleight of hand.
Marian Tupy.
There is just so much in the public sphere that is simply untrue because different people are pushing different agendas. In the United States, for example, if you measure poverty, relative poverty, the way that the government does, which is by income, then anywhere between 8 and 12% of Americans are in relative poverty, depending on whether the economy is booming or it is in recession. But if you look at how much people spend, it's 2.5%. How does it happen? Well, I mean, people don't report their income. It's as simple as that. Secondly, the business about inequality. United States, when they calculate inequality between different quintiles, that's 20%, 20, they do not take into account taxes and transfers, which means that they look at notional or market income, and then they calculate that inequality in the United States is basically 16 to 1. The richest quintile has 16 times as much income as the poorest quintile. This is insane. Nobody ever sees that check, that market income, because the government will take 30 to 40% of that income and transfers it to poor people. And as a consequence of that, once you make that simple adjustment that a child could make, income inequality in the United States between the top and the bottom quintile falls from 16 to 1 to 4 to 1. And I don't think it is crazy to think that the richest people in a society, the top quintile should be 4 times richer.
Okay, let's talk about the link between population and resources, population growth and resources, and take us back to 1968. The Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich and his prediction about the population bomb. Tell us about that controversy.
So that's what my second book is devoted to. After the Second World War, with a tremendous amount of new science that was penetrating poorer countries, there was a massive increase in population. And by the late 1960s, a lot of people, including the World Bank, the United Nations, Richard Nixon, were concerned about overpopulation. And Paul Ehrlich, the Stanford University professor, came up with a book, Population Bomb, basically claiming that in the succeeding 2 decades, hundreds of millions of people would die as a result of starvation. There wouldn't be no food because there are simply too many people and too few resources. On the other side of the United States, in Maryland, he was at Stanford in California. In Maryland, there was an American economist, senior fellow at Cato, so it happened, Julian Simon, who basically looked at the numbers and realized that resources were falling in price. Food prices were falling rather than increasing. So they had a bet. Simon challenged Ehrlich to a bet. Ehrlich took the bet, and Ehrlich it was his right to select the commodities to bet on, and he chose 5 commodities: copper, chromium, tin, tungsten, and zinc. And the bet would last from 1980 to 1990. In that period of time, humanity added another 700 million people, and the prices of these 5 resources fell by 36%. To which my side, our side, declared victory, and but Paul Ehrlich said this changes nothing, and indeed it changed nothing.
We still lost the bet, though.
He lost the bet, and he had to write Simon a check for $567. But this was $1,000 bet, and he lost more than half of it. But the bottom line is that today at Davos, with what's his name, Eric Schmidt? No, what's Schwab. And Schwab keeps talking about the necessity for a small population, lower consumption, regulations on consumption. And Paul Ehrlich is still on TV, as he was 2 days ago on the Weather Channel when I was in Houston.
And he's what, in his 90s, I take it?
He's 90, yeah.
This is Malthus, right? Malthusian principles?
It really goes back to antiquity. There were some cultures that were obsessing about too many people in the world. The Greeks didn't have a positive attitude to population growth. Plato believed that a perfect society should only have 5,324 people. But Malthus, an English preacher, I don't know why I'm gesticulating at you because you're Scottish. You have nothing to do with this. But an English preacher, he wrote it all up in 1798 and provided a sort of a scholarly patina to it. He said that he showed mathematically that this would have to happen. It didn't.
Yes, and so the line here is that if you have a bigger population, you're going to run out of resources. This is the line.
This is the Malthusian view.
That's the Malthusian line, which you've debunked. But it is interesting that several unhinged people who go around and kill a lot of innocent people. I'll just give you a few examples. Yeah. Anders Breivik from Norway. This guy Brendan Tarrant, in Christchurch, New Zealand. I think that was in 2019. There's a recent attack in El Paso, Texas. They fully embraced the Malthusian manifesto.
Yeah, and we call this group of people eco-fascists. They're not simply dissatisfied with governments making propaganda or governments asking people to have fewer babies or even punishing. They actually want to do it themselves, and so we had we had a number of mass murders in the Anglosphere where people killed others in order to decrease global population. And this is not just environment is not generally thought of as a sort of right-wing phenomenon. These people that you described, they targeted brown people, and so we would call them eco-fascists. There was some weird combination of caring about the environment and at the same time wanting to kill brown people. But it's also happened on the left. After all, Ted Kaczynski was a leftist, and he was the Unabomber. He was also guided by Malthusian ideas.
It's probably worth mentioning as well that the other consequence of his population bomb theory was the Chinese government's one-child policy.
Yes.
I mean, so they've got one of the biggest countries on earth genuinely believe this stuff, and they, with calamitous consequences.
They're paying the price now.
Yeah, where China's still ruling from right now. So this just goes to show the power of these bad, disproven ideas. And I don't know how many people were never born as a result of this misunderstanding of human nature.
Yeah. Okay, let me test your thesis here, because you're obviously very optimistic about the world, but you also study contemporary politics. And if you look at the United States, there's no question that Donald Trump has resonated with a lot of so-called white working class people from Rust Belt states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio and that area of the Northwest. And likewise in England, in Northern England, the Midlands, there has been what's been called a harrowing out of the working class base. And they're agitated, they're disillusioned, and they blame globalisation, they blame free trade, they blame China's entry into the WTO, and of course they blame technological change. What's the response to that argument that capitalism has created these losers?
Yeah, there are two ways of seeing this. One is to think that we are in a world where, in my view, Trump will probably be the next president.
Really? You go that far already?
My hunch, if I had to bet on one of them, I'd bet on Trump. And it's amazing to think that Biden and Trump will be the choice presented to the American electorate, which is a good case, I think, for ending this American experiment in self-government and call for the king's protection, I think. Anyway, but the thing is, this is what we see as course correction in a democracy. Now, these guys are angry, but for a large extent, they are right to be angry, because they see the economy going in a way which doesn't benefit them or the society they live in, and they also see a government which doesn't seem to care very much, that says, look, if it's net positive for the economy, then that's good, but you guys are the losers, so you're going to have to live with that. And I think the cries of pain in a democracy, whether they're articulated brilliantly or through a Truntish grump, are nonetheless really worth paying attention to. If I was a Democrat right now, I'd be thinking, okay, let's look at all of these Trump voters and let's work out what we can do to make them feel.
Can you win them back on a principle of free trade and free markets?
Look, free trade and free markets are always very hard to sell to the electorate. Throughout British history, it's difficult right now in American. So of course, it sounds, for something in the drawbridge up, everything from the Corn Laws onwards, the drawbridge up mentality always seems superficially attractive. It did in lockdown as well. People get scared. They want to just stop the trade. So it is difficult unless you can actually start to prove, here you are, look at your shopping, it is that much cheaper because of free trade. Now, I think that is...
So they blame their lost jobs on exporting them to high growth economies like China and Mexico.
Yeah, they do.
Isn't that globalisation?
And deindustrialisation has, well, there's no doubt about it, that globalisation has moved some of these safer, these less safe, more dangerous jobs abroad. But the idea is the economy will create more jobs overall. These will be better jobs. So it's up to those on our side of a debate to say to them, yes, you're right, this factory has closed down, but let's look at all the new jobs. Look at what proportion of this community are now doing jobs that didn't exist 20 years ago. They're safer jobs. Your kids are less likely to die in a factory or be at risk from the health things that coming work and manual labour. So there is an argument to make about progress. But I think it's one of the things that we must be careful doing is basically like claiming it's not happening, because these jobs are going abroad.
But the centre-right Republican Party, as you well know, Marian, the party of Reagan used to believe in free markets, free trade, pro-immigration. And now it seems like the party of Trump, it's a party of anti-immigration, protectionism, a big government. That must depress you.
Yeah, I mean, I've only been an American for 9 years, so I don't have such a long memory. But yes, this is the first time really in American history, probably, certainly since the Great Depression, that you don't have at least one American political party saying that things either are getting better or have a potential to be getting better. Democrats have been poo-pooing the American economy for a long time, but Republicans are doing exactly the same thing. They've given up on the so-called given up on the American dream, and I think that part of it has to do with the fact that, again, people are mostly confused about what is happening in the job market. A vast majority of those jobs that have been lost to blue-collar Americans have not gone to China, they've gone to automation. The reason why we are rich, the reason why we have all the nice things is because we no longer make them by hand and mostly not by human beings. It's because we have outsourced it to machines. It's the machines that work 24 hours a day that can create the superabundance that I'm talking about in my second book. And it is to that automation that 75% of those jobs were lost. And the latest studies that I've seen on the impact of globalization and international trade on the American economy, which is the only thing I can speak about, is that globalization has created as many jobs in export industries in the United States as have been lost in import industries. And final point is, I think that what really is happening in these places that voted for Trump is that you have urbanization going on. Young people are leaving small town America. They are moving to cities, leaving behind them dilapidated communities where, because of outflow of population, social safety net and social structures and society is basically breaking down, and whoever leaves is behind is basically tied to those areas through social welfare nets and so forth. And the best thing that we could do for them is for them to move.
Let's finally turn to culture before we go to Q&A in the audience. Fraser, let me put something that I wrote. Let me put this to you. It's what I wrote in the Australian newspaper about a year or so ago, that the notion that people are helpless without the state is indicative of a collapse of self-confidence that increasingly calls into question the fundamentals of Western society. Christianity, the conventional family unit, the canon of Western civilization, literature, its architecture, above all, conventional interpretations of its history, and its tradition of freedom of expression are coming under continued attack from a minority of left-wing activists. So the question here is, aren't you depressed about the rise of what's called the woke movement?
Yes, I am pretty depressed about it, actually. And coming to Australia, this is some things do jump out at me. Now, I was just over the road in your beautiful botanical gardens there, and you've got a statue to the first governor of New South Wales, and around it are these pillars on which this culture they're building, education, justice, the various things which, of course, these pioneers were deliberately building, thinking, okay, we're going to build a civilization here. These are the pillars we're going to build it over, and everything stems from then. And we went through, and of course, you have these gardens there. You've got the pictures of various people from classical antiquity. I mean, the idea is there's that idea of the collective things which made our culture great has not just been lost, but they've now started becoming attacking. You notice now that the more feeling that this colonialism was a terrible thing, that
and the decolonisation of curriculum at universities.
Yeah, exactly. And so you are now the thing that when you have a look at the rise of identity politics, the emphasising on things that divide people rather than unite them, this is growing and becoming particularly pernicious. It's going out of the universities now. It's into the workplaces, and you're starting to see this, my former colleague Kemi Badenoch describes as the re-racialization of society. So Kemi is a Nigerian, she's married to a white guy, and she was saying that, when she was young, she thought she grew up in a world where nobody cares what the skin colour was. Now, all of a sudden, her kids are growing up into a world where they're being told, yes, you're black, and this means X, Y, and Z. So hence the word re-racialization. But then again, I do see this being pushed back. I see it being pushed back in Australia. I think the referendum you guys have had was the first time in the world there's been a referendum on the principle of identity politics. And Americans have rejected it by a stonking majority. And I see in Jacinta Price, this politician,
former colleague at CIS.
Yeah. So but I'd never heard of her until this campaign. But you listen to her there, and she's now.
Well, hang on, I wrote about it for your magazine.
Yes, we did commission Tom to write for the Spectator a few weeks ago about her. But here you have got the antimatter to all of these guys. You've got this passionate, articulate, effortless politician who is now speaking as eloquently about what unites us as the work guys do about what divides us. So I do think that it's got to a critical. I think for a long stage, Conservatives looked at this like rabbits in the headlights, not knowing how to respond to it, thinking, yes, we're bad people, we're terrible, we're colonists, etc. And then there will come a point where politicians like Jacinta Price will say, no, this is not a racist country, this is an incredible civilization. Colonization has been good for Aboriginals, she was saying a few months ago, to great consternation. So you will actually. So I see there a reason to be optimistic. I'm going to leave Australia with a note of optimism, having seen the aftermath of your referendum campaign.
Notwithstanding Fraser's points, though, the cold hard reality, Marian, is that this cancel culture mindset has been intensifying in the Western world. I'll just give you a few examples. The trappings of Western civilization are virtually unworthy of study at universities. People require safe spaces so they can be spared the trauma of hearing opinions different from their own. A man identifying as a woman is the same as being born biologically female. A woman who accuses a man of sexual harassment is presumed a victim before any trial takes place. I mean, to the extent that these trends continue, isn't that grounds grounds for contradicting your thesis about optimism?
Well, my work is one of economic history, or history for that matter. So I'm looking backwards from the present and saying that today is much better than what preceded it. But there is no some sort of deterministic force in the universe or on Earth that would guarantee that everything is going to work out. We could still blow it. And indeed, previous civilizations have done so. Rome in 2nd century was, by all accounts, a very good place to live. Then you have Dark Ages. Song China in 12th century, 11th century was a great place to live in. And then came the Qing and the Ming, and 500 years of stagnation. So civilizations can indeed die, and innovativeness can die, and these economic and social and cultural fluorescences can die with them.
Yeah, I think Scott Fraser once said there is a great deal of ruin in a nation.
Yeah, that was Adam Smith wrote that in a letter, and he's right. But let's remember, the woke movement is still relatively young. And I do think we get these trends in democracy, people have self-doubt, etc. And again, I was talking earlier about the paradox of progress, how we're always on the lookout for things going wrong. People for a long time been talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, etc. This is what healthy democracies do. They scan their culture, they think, hang on a minute, this line of argument could undermine and undo everything. Usually, there is a counter movement, and the forces of progress will win. So I'm a believer in what Martin Luther King said about the arc of the moral universe being long and bending towards justice and progress. So there will be these hiccups along the way, but overall, I think Marianne's graphs are.
Okay, now finally, questions, and our first question comes from, any hands up? Adrian.
Thank you, guys. So, as someone who is quite young, my generation has experienced two major crises, as you say, the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. How would you persuade people like me, or people of my age, the case that free markets and optimism is the way to go?
I collect quite a lot of data from my job, graphs on everything. And there's an internal folder that I direct my young colleagues to. It's called SFM, Stop Flipping Moaning. And that is there to show them, like what Marianne said, when you look at the price of a house compared to your mortgage power, it's actually better than ever. Look how you've got these travel options you never had before. Look at your entertainment options. Look at just how much more you can get for your money. So there's lots of these things which I try, unsuccessfully, shall I say, to get my colleagues to say, look, objectively, look at this. Oh, so what's the terrible thing that you can't, you're having to pay for more of your university than your dad did? But let's look at statistically, you wouldn't have been at university a couple of generations ago. So again, it's human nature to think, well, my dad lived in a better place than I did, or I can't get it afford. That it is difficult really to point to any sliding in generational progress. I did a documentary for Channel 4 about the just demonstrating how people think that their disposable income is lower than that of the parents. As a commonly held view, but there's no evidence to support it at all. Now, how can you persuade somebody of that, by the way, other than showing them the graphs? But one of the things I've also found out is that these graphs do not win arguments. It can be a great mistake that people on our side of the debate can make to think that I can give you a figure, sir, and change your mind.
Marian.
Fraser, I'm glad you pointed to Britain. I didn't know that. In the United States, Jane Twenge has just published a newest study on American intergenerational wealth, and the Gen Z and the millennials are just as wealthy as their parents were at this stage in their lives. So it's not true that they are falling behind.
And also, as a footnote to that, Adrian, I'd point you to the scholarship of our chief economist, Peter Tulip, on housing affordability. The problem is not capitalism. The problem is government regulation, supply, and that makes it more expensive for young people to enter the housing market.
However, in a society which prizes victimhood and self-pity about everything else, such as the United States, it's almost improper to point out to young people in America that actually their incomes are not lower than those of their parents. It is almost considered bad manners to stop moaning and to tell them the truth. Encouraging and gratifying whatever it is that people are complaining about seems to be the most obvious way in which a politician can get the votes. Everybody wants to be an empathizer in chief. And presenting people with hard statistics is almost considered to be cruel.
Next question, Salvatore Barbonis, who's a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of Sydney, who's published some groundbreaking reports for CIS. Salvatore.
Thank you. Do you believe that young people who endorse socialism actually want to shop in state supermarkets, drink coffee in state cafes, live in public housing, take a state airline on their next holiday? And if you don't believe that, then what do you think socialism means to people who answer these surveys?
That is a really good question, because they've got, I mean, let's face it, the younger generation have got nothing really to point to unless they've actually been to Venezuela. So what do they, but they would give you another definition of it. They say, look, okay, Fraser, you're talking back in your Cold War terms now. When I say I want a more socialist economy, what I mean is I want these really rich guys to pay a lot more in tax, and that money is going to basically go towards helping me get on the housing ladder. But that's what they by and large mean. So I think when they use the word socialism, we apply it in its classical definition, but that's not really what's on their mind. But I'm also struck, though, just how, I mean, Timothy Garton-Ash was saying this, that amongst his young students, what proportion of them to think capitalism is, don't like free speech, don't like capitalism. Some of them will even say, we don't want to bring a child into the world now because things are so bad. This is not an uncommon opinion, and the people who say that say it sincerely. So it is, I think, the a part of it, I think, by the way, is the way the education system tends to bend itself towards eco-catastrophism. So when you learn about the environment at school now, my kids are 13 and 15, as well as my daughter is 10, and they come back from school being taught all sorts of things about, when is the last tree going to be chopped down, etc. Now, and my son, actually, to his credit, inverted it and worked out when the last corner of England would be overtaken by a tree that wasn't already. So you can take, but the thing is, they get fed this diet of pessimism at school, in a way which is intended to make them more socially conscious, and they can genuinely leave school thinking this is the world, the planet is burning. But I can't bring a kid in. Everything is going wrong. So it is pretty difficult to be exposed to the other narrative.
Next question, Claire Lehman, the editor of Quillette and also a columnist with The Australian. Yeah. Claire.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the stimulating conversation, guys. My question is about declining fertility rates in rich countries. So we know that women in rich countries are having fewer and fewer children. I think in Sydney, the birth rate, the fertility rate here is lower than in South Korea. I think it's something like 1.1 child per woman. Now, obviously, that's a bad thing. We want more babies to be born. We want more human capital. But is there a trade-off? And is there a trap that comes with wealth and getting richer? When women are earning money and having an improved standard of living, do we fall into this situation where we don't want to trade off our lifestyle? And, we've developed these skills through our education, that we make the choice not to have babies. And is that a trap that rich countries are falling into? And if so, how do we turn it around?
Probably. And the reason for that is that, as David Deutsch from Oxford points out, as a solution of every problem leads to a creation of a new problem, usually a smaller one. Perfect example would be the massive famines that were taking place around the world at all times, and hundreds of millions of people were dying. And then came the Green Revolution and other ways in which we have increased our agricultural productivity, and we are able to feed everybody, which has led to a problem, obesity. And hopefully we are on the cusp of addressing that problem with Ozempic and other drugs, which is probably going to lead to some sort of another problem that we haven't even foreseen. We just hope that it is smaller. I am quite open to the idea that as a result of superabundance, and rights which women rightly possess, they are less likely to stay at home, have children. Not all. Some women are perfectly happy to do it, and that's totally fine, and some don't. So we have a problem. We have overcome the problem of female subjugation and poverty. Now we have a problem of women not wanting to have babies. And how are we going to solve the problem? We are not going to force women to have children, but maybe in a few years or within a decade, we are going to have artificial womb where you can deposit and a robot nanny to take care of it. So
this progress. Is it such a great thing after all?
I don't think that. I don't know why artificial wombs should be at all yucky. I mean, the baby will be completely safe.
Okay. Let's move on. And next question, Peter Ritchie. Peter Ritchie, of course, an embodiment of a long-time chief executive of McDonald's, an embodiment of globalisation. Great to see you, Peter.
Marian, thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation.
Very kind of you.
My wife and I came here specifically for an injection of hope.
And instead you hear about the artificial womb.
Yeah, well, and that,
Don't start.
let's forget that part. She after your presentation, she whispered to me, "I'm cured." So, of her depression, I mean, yeah. I had a question though that, I mean, as much as your presentation projects hope and a wonderful future, do you ever talk to audiences who are antagonistic or at the very least sceptical? And if you do, what do they pick on? What is the thing that they say, that's got to be bullshit, you know?
Most audiences are pretty receptive. The people who hate progress most are the progressives, and
progressives in quotation marks.
Yes. I mean, they are regressive, and what did we have recently? Gays for Palestine, gays for Hamas, or something like that. So these people are gays for Hamas. I mean, it's insane. So these people are regressive. What drives them is. I think that what a lot of the people on the far left cannot stomach is that we have created this wonderful civilization by means of which they disapprove. Yeah, I mean, I walk down in Sydney and I look unbelievable beauty and everything is working and everything is clean. But you got here, through colonialism and capitalism, and that is simply unacceptable. So one of the determined goals of the far left is to undermine the legitimacy, the morality of how we got here, because then the institutions themselves can become illegitimate and discredited.
So can I just jump in? I think it's such an important question, because when I'm making these arguments amongst my colleagues, I'm wondering, why do they all, they mock me for this? I mean, recently, I did my 500 issues editor recently, and in my line of work, you get a mock front page, and they put exclusive, everything is getting better by Fraser, right? That was, by and large, how they think I come into work every day. Now, so it seemed to be market privilege that a rich person can sit here saying everything is great. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the instinctive feel is that you're cherry picking. That yes, you found 15 graphs in this thing, but I bet there's somebody who can show you 15 graphs saying everything is getting worse. So there is, and also the other belief is that it's somehow immoral, right? That we should be focusing on what's wrong, not what's right. Because the moment you're focusing on what's right, you're saying, let's take the foot off the pedal and let's just ignore the injustices. So people do act viscerally against it, in my understanding. And I think the best thing which we can try to do is to make it easier to find out these facts for themselves. I think Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness, has sold so well because people pick it up and they just didn't believe half of the stuff in that book. So I think the availability of data is a major part of it. I think when our kids leave school now, they have to go almost in a re-education to find out the bits that they weren't told in their classes. And I think the incredible progress we're making on the environment is something you pick up almost nothing about in school. It was like a sort of verboten sort of curriculum that you have to pass about in a samizdat kind of way.
And on that note, one of our regular guests over the years has been Bjorn Lomborg, who makes those points.
Yeah.
Final question to our chairman, Nicholas Moore.
Thanks, guys. I think it was a terrific presentation. Just one question on social media and this device. Obviously, that changed the world arguably as much as printing changed the world. And we know what happened after printing came in. Obviously, we had an explosion of knowledge and an explosion of emotion. I think part of the debate we're talking about, coming back to your Scottish roots, is about emotion versus rationality and how the two combine. How do you think this is playing into that underlying conflict within humanity between emotion versus rationality? And is emotion, armed with social media and what have you, actually tipping the balance in terms of what we're talking about and leading to the discontinuity we're talking about in terms of what's happening and the progress we can see versus what people are feeling?
Well, I think, this is almost like my line of work here, and I do think with social media, again, it's been proven that the more extreme your statement, the more it will get shared. The way Twitter's constructed, but now every tweet, how many retweets were there, how many likes. Now, and this has, again, been proven to encourage people to make the most outlandish things. When you go on Twitter, it gives little things saying what's happening. That's not what's happening. Twitter found out with things which you're likely to object to the most. So here's somebody making an outlandish claim. Please, Fraser, we invite you to make some comment on it. So Twitter invites a deranged, but it's supposed to be addictive, and it is addictive, conversation. So you start to see these cartoon caricatures, and you start to scroll rather than read, and you start to amplify fringe voices you'd never otherwise have heard of, start to become very big. In The Spectator, I've got a list of people we're not allowed to mention. They're like Katie Hopkins, Owen Jones, kind of people who basically live on Twitter. They're not really people. They're just there to be kind of like pantomime freaks. But Twitter puts them to center stage and gives you this world. It's a freak show world. But what we also see this like during the pandemic, it promoted panic in an incredible way, which probably led to the lockdowns, because look, here's what's happening in Italy, here's the videos, and by the way, it's going to be your house next. And fear spreads, so if panic can spread like a contagion, the most extreme views can spread like a contagion. And if you want to be the still small voice of Cam, as Marian has been tonight, then good luck to you getting very many shares on Twitter. And I think the problem is that when we grew up, a generation, and many colleagues do that, they scroll rather than read. If you look at your screen time, how many hours you're spending on Twitter. If it's more than 8, that's a novel you could have read. But when that Instagram has now entered the top 10 sources of news in the United Kingdom. It's now ahead of almost any newspaper. That's Instagram. Like Facebook is now the number 1 source of written news. Now, we're then seeing, so I'm talking earlier about the stories I choose as editor. But who is choosing these stories? Who's choosing Facebook? As the algorithms will point to the most extreme things. And going back earlier on, people will pay attention to what's going wrong. So we are going to have a whole generation growing up, seeing the world through these devices, which are going to promote the most alarmist stories and are going to make it very difficult for anybody to add context, because the thing that people do add context, the journalists, the papers, are fast going out of fashion. I think you're telling me earlier that 4% of Gen Z get their news from a newspaper.
4%.
Yeah, 4%. Well, that's your figure. I'm just quoting it back at you, you know. But to me, this is a real. When it comes to understanding our world, the solutions, we need to really recognise that the newspapers that we're so fond of complaining about are dying out as a source of information. Now Mark Zuckerberg has got more power than Murdoch, than Hearst or Beaverbrook, whoever programs these algorithms for what you find out.
Fraser,
when you put
you're
in
making
news.
the case for pessimism.
Oh, sorry. Look. The world is getting better, but in terms of why people think the opposite, part of it is because the media is now being ceded to people who've got no sense of responsibility or bias. They just want to keep you addicted, and that sense of addiction, in my view, we're going to in 10 years' time realise how bad it is now. I think we're just beginning to now, and we're going to wonder why we let our kids stay at it all day long.
Concluding thoughts, Marian.
Yeah, progress doesn't mean that everything is working out. There are always challenges. question is whether we are in general moving forward. I would just simply mention that it always takes humanity to adjust to a new technology. When printing press started, the books that people were reading was not Erasmus, it was wolves, vampires and witches, and that's what people consumed, and so it's a new technology. I hope that people will get adjusted to it. More and more people. I've left Facebook 12 years ago. A lot of people are leaving Facebook. Some never started. A lot of people are giving up Twitter. So hopefully we'll find a X, and we'll find some sort of a new balance.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Marian Tupy and Fraser Nelson. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.